Daniel Notarianni, we need to discuss the transport truck crossing on your Queenston-Lewiston Bridge. The RCMP investigation determined you did not follow CBSA policy, truck Cannabis Act. You took tobacco worth millions of dollars, entered it through your lane.
Daniel Notarianni operated without real oversight for months as a CBSA officer at one of Canada's busiest commercial truck crossings. Millions of dollars in contraband crossed into Canada through his lane. Not one secondary inspection was triggered.
I'll be addressing all of this through the proper legal process. I stand behind my professional conduct.
The bridge cameras kept rolling long after he waved that truck through. They had been rolling for months. Every shift, every plate, every commercial manifest he stamped. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police would later allege that one of those crossings, somewhere in late 2025, carried opium, cannabis, and tobacco worth millions of dollars into Canada through his primary inspection lane. In January 2026, RCMP Federal Policing officers walked into Daniel Notarianni's life and arrested him. By March, the charges were public. Breach of trust by a public officer. Multiple counts under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Multiple counts under the Cannabis Act. He has not entered a plea. He is presumed innocent. But the case file is already open. The evidence is already sealed, and the questions are already being asked in a Welland courtroom. Quick question before we go any further. When an entire transport truck full of contraband can cross an international border on a single officer's decision, how many other crossings deserve a second look? Drop your answer below. Subscribe if you're new here. We cover Canadian and American border integrity cases that mainstream coverage tends to forget about after the headline week. These stories matter, and the follow-through matters more. Daniel Anthony Notarianni was born in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the spring of 1986. His father, Vincenzo Notarianni, had immigrated from a small town in Abruzzo in 1971 and spent 31 years working the line at the General Motors plant on Ontario Street. His mother, Rosa, kept the books for a small Italian bakery on Geneva Street that opened in 1978 and stayed open through 2 recessions, the slow death of the GM plant, and the long, grinding transformation of the Niagara-region from steel and auto country into wineries and tourist money. Daniel was the youngest of 3. Both his older brothers went to McMaster. He did not. He went to Niagara College in Welland for police foundations, finished the diploma in 2007, and spent the next 2 years applying to anything in uniform that would take him. Niagara Regional Police passed on him twice. The RCMP told him to try again in a year. The Ontario Provincial Police kept him on a long list and never called back. He worked the door at a casino in Niagara Falls for 14 months. He worked as a commissionaire at a federal building in St. Catharines for another 9. He cleared $7,800 in his best month and $2,300 in his worst. He was 23 years old, watching the Niagara region pull itself apart and reassemble around tourism revenue, while his older brothers built professional lives in Toronto and Calgary. In the fall of 2010, he applied to the Canada Border Services Agency. He was 24. The application took 11 months to process. He was called for the Officer Induction Training Program at the CBSA College in Rigaud, Quebec, in late 2011. The program ran 18 weeks. He passed every module. His final evaluation described him as attentive to procedural detail and comfortable with high-volume traffic environments. His starting salary as a probationary officer was $58,200. His first posting was the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie, the secondary commercial lanes, working the manifest desk while senior officers ran the booths. He spent 4 years there. He learned the rhythm of cross-border traffic. He learned which carriers were reliable, which had a history of cargo discrepancies, which dispatchers would call ahead about a difficult driver. He earned positive evaluations every year. In 2016, he transferred to the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge, closer to his parents in St. Catharines, closer to the house he had just bought in Niagara-on-the-Lake with his wife, Adriana, a registered nurse at the Greater Niagara General Hospital. Their daughter, Sophia, was born in 2017. Their son, Marco, in 2019. By 2022, Daniel Notarianni was a Customs Border Services officer, the SEDU, at the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge, working primary inspection in the commercial lanes. He made $84,400 a year before overtime. He coached his daughter's Tyke hockey team at the Virgil Arena. He had a season pass to the Meridian Center in St. Catharines to watch the Niagara Ice Dogs. He drove a 2018 Ford F-150 with a Niagara-on-the-Lake parking permit and a Tim Hortons travel mug welded permanently to the console. His CBSA personnel file would later show no formal discipline, no civilian complaints, no use of force incidents, 15 years on the job. By every external measure available to anyone outside the agency, Daniel Notarianni was exactly the officer the CBSA wanted, manning the busiest commercial truck crossing between Ontario and Western New York State. The Queenston-Lewiston Bridge spans the Niagara River between Queenston, Ontario, and Lewiston, New York. It opened in 1962. It carries more than 4 million vehicles a year. It is one of 4 international bridges in the Niagara-region, and along with the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie, it is one of the 2 busiest commercial truck crossings in southern Ontario. On a typical weekday, between 1,500 and 2,000 commercial trucks cross northbound into Canada through the Queenston Plaza. Each of those trucks passes through a CBSA primary inspection lane staffed by a single officer. The primary inspection process is supposed to work like this. The truck stops at the booth. The driver hands over the commercial cargo manifest, the bill of lading, the pre-arrival clearance number, the driver's commercial documentation, and any required permits for the specific cargo class. The officer in the booth runs the manifest against the Accelerated Commercial Release Operations Support System. The officer queries the truck's plate, the carrier code, the driver's fast card, if applicable, and the cargo manifest against CBSA's targeting and risk assessment databases. The officer asks the driver a short series of questions about the cargo, the origin, the destination, and any undeclared items. If anything in that process triggers a referral, a database hit, a manifest discrepancy, a driver inconsistency, a cargo class flagged for verification, or simple officer discretion, the truck is sent to secondary examination. Secondary is where the bay doors are. Secondary is where the X-ray gantries are. Secondary is where the dog handler runs the trailer. Secondary is where contraband actually gets found. If nothing triggers a referral, the officer releases the truck into Canada. The truck rolls off the bridge plaza, merges onto the Queenston-Lewiston Highway, joins the QEW, and disappears into the Ontario commercial trucking grid within minutes. A primary inspection at the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge takes on average between 45 seconds and 3 minutes. The decision to refer or release belongs entirely to the officer in the booth. That is the structural feature the RCMP investigation would later allege Daniel Notarianni exploited. Not a technical bypass, not a tampered database, not a forged document, a discretionary decision, one commercial truck, one primary inspection lane, one officer, and a release that, the RCMP alleges, should never have been granted. The RCMP's allegations about how the scheme actually operated are still being developed in court filings, but the public framing from RCMP Federal Policing Central Region and from Superintendent Dale Foote, the officer in charge of border integrity, sketches the architecture clearly enough. Sometime in late 2025 or early 2026, a transport truck and trailer approached the northbound Queenston-Lewiston Bridge primary inspection plaza. The driver, identified in subsequent court documents only as Abhishek, presented commercial documentation for a load that, on paper, was unremarkable. Inside the trailer, according to the RCMP, was something else entirely. Opium, cannabis, tobacco, 3 contraband categories, different source chains, different downstream markets, different penalty schedules under Canadian law, all consolidated into a single trailer for a single trip across a single border. That kind of consolidation is operationally significant. Opium is not a routine seizure category in modern Canadian border data. Canadian seizures are dominated by cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, and cannabis. Opium specifically, the raw poppy product, not its synthetic descendants, moves on a tighter, older, more international supply chain, traditionally tied to Afghan source country production. Tobacco contraband is its own category, driven by the gap between Canadian and American retail tobacco prices, and historically concentrated in the Niagara and Kanawaki corridors. Cannabis, despite being legal in Canada under the Cannabis Act since October 2018, remains federally illegal in the United States. The smuggling of American cannabis into Canada is itself a structural marker. It suggests either a transit point architecture, an attempt to inject unregulated product into the legal Canadian retail channel, or both. 3 contraband types in one trailer means a network. It means coordination between distinct supply chains. It means a logistics operation sophisticated enough to consolidate risk across product lines and patient enough to wait for the right primary inspection lane. The RCMP's allegation is that the truck reached the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge on a shift Daniel Notarianni was working. It is alleged the truck was routed to his primary inspection lane. It is alleged Notarianni did not follow CBSA inspection policy on that crossing. The truck was not referred to secondary examination. The X-ray gantry was not used. The dog handler was not called. The contraband, the RCMP alleges, crossed into Canada in the back of that trailer because the officer in the booth waved it through. Whether that decision was a single isolated act or part of a longer pattern is one of the questions the investigation continues to pursue. What is not in dispute at this stage is the architecture the alleged conduct exploited. The same architecture that makes the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge an economic artery between Ontario and the United States. The discretionary release authority of a single officer over a high-capacity commercial vehicle is the architecture that makes it, in the hands of a corrupted officer, an industrial-scale smuggling vulnerability. A passenger car can carry 10 kilograms of cocaine in a trunk void. A transport truck can carry hundreds of kilograms in a trailer. The math for an organized smuggling network is not subtle. The math for the network that allegedly built the load that crossed the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge that day was the difference between a routine medium-risk shipment and a multi-million-dollar single-trip windfall. The unraveling did not start with a tip. It did not start with a confidential informant. It did not start with a routine seizure in another jurisdiction. According to the RCMP, the unraveling started inside the Canada Border Services Agency itself. Superintendent Dale Foote, when he announced the charges in March 2026, was careful with his phrasing. When the CBSA brought this information forward, he said, "Our members were able to respond quickly and carry out a careful, impartial investigation. The charges announced today reflect our commitment to upholding the law with integrity and consistency." The phrase that matters is "brought this information forward." It is not a phrase that describes an external complaint. It is not a phrase that describes a citizen tip, or a cooperating witness, or a parallel investigation by an American agency. It is a phrase that describes an internal referral. The CBSA's own integrity and professional standards apparatus identifying a problem and handing it to a federal police agency with the criminal investigative mandate to develop it. That is a structural change. Earlier border corruption cases in the Niagara-region, including the 2017 Chad Gale matter at the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie, surfaced through different mechanisms. Joint forces operations, external cooperators, parallel narcotics investigations. The Notarianni allegations, by contrast, surfaced because the CBSA's own internal affairs detection infrastructure, looking at primary inspection records, manifest data, referral rates, and the after-the-fact reconstruction of a specific crossing, flagged something it could not explain. What exactly the CBSA flagged, and when, is not yet public. The RCMP's investigative timeline indicates that the agency referral happened in time for federal investigators to develop sufficient evidence to support an arrest warrant by January 2026. That suggests a referral somewhere in the back half of 2025, after the alleged truck crossing event, with enough specific information attached to permit a focused criminal investigation rather than a fishing expedition. For Daniel Notarianni, working his regular rotation at the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge through the autumn of 2025 and into the first weeks of 2026, the catalyst was something he could not see. His own employer had already opened a file on him. His own colleagues, somewhere in the integrity apparatus he never interacted with directly, had already begun the careful, paper trail work of reconstructing what they believed had happened in his booth on a specific day, with a specific truck, with a specific driver named Abhishek behind the wheel. We are heading into the investigation and the arrest now. Before we do, leave a comment letting us know where you are watching from, and consider subscribing. We cover border integrity and public corruption cases on both sides of the Canada-US border that mainstream coverage tends to drop after the initial headline. These stories matter, and the follow-through matters more. The RCMP file that landed at Federal Policing Central Region in Ontario in late 2025 was not a complete case. It was a starting point. Superintendent Foote's investigators had to build the rest. The Forensic Foundation, as alleged in court documents and reflected in public RCMP statements, rests on 6 pillars. First, CBSA assignment records establishing that Officer Notarianni was, in fact, manning a primary inspection lane at the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge on the specific date the transport truck and trailer crossed northbound. Second, the documentary trail of the crossing itself, the commercial manifest the driver presented, the timestamp of the inspection, the booth identifier, and the absence of a referral to secondary examination. Third, the post-crossing evidence establishing that the truck did, in fact, contain opium, cannabis, and tobacco in quantities worth millions of dollars. Fourth, internal CBSA integrity and professional standards documentation establishing that Notarianni's actions during the inspection deviated from agency policy. Fifth, RCMP Federal Policing investigative evidence connecting the alleged conduct to the broader smuggling architecture, communications, financial records, association evidence, and surveillance product, the components of any federal-level border corruption case. Sixth, the simultaneous arrest and parallel prosecution of the truck driver, Abhishek, whose own case is being handled separately and whose own court appearances were scheduled for April 2026. Those 6 pillars are what the RCMP needs to translate an internal CBSA referral into a Crown prosecution under Section 122 of the Criminal Code. Breach of trust by a public officer is not a casual charge. It requires proof that the accused was a public officer acting in connection with the duties of that office, who committed an act constituting a serious and marked departure from the standards expected of a person in the accused's position, with the intent to use the position for a purpose other than the public good. The standard is high, it is meant to be high. The Crown's allegation, on the public record so far, is that the architecture of the case, assignment records, crossing documentation, contraband evidence, internal CBSA analysis, federal investigative product, and a parallel prosecution of the smuggler together meets that standard. It is also worth marking what the RCMP's public framing has not said. There is no public allegation, at this stage, of a specific dollar payment to Notarianni. There is no public allegation of a long-running pattern across multiple crossings. There is no public allegation of involvement by other CBSA officers. The case as charged is a single incident allegation tied to a single transport truck and a single primary inspection decision. Whether that picture stays narrow or widens as the prosecution proceeds is one of the open questions of the file. Notarianni's defense will have the opportunity to test every one of those 6 pillars in court. The Crown's burden on each count is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He is presumed innocent until that test is concluded. The arrest came in January 2026. The exact morning has not been disclosed publicly, and the RCMP has declined to confirm specific operational details about the takedown. What is on the public record is this. RCMP Federal Policing officers from Central Region executed an arrest warrant for Daniel Notarianni. The truck driver, Abhishek, was arrested at the same time, as part of what the RCMP described as a coordinated operation. Notarianni was not on shift when he was taken into custody. The RCMP had timed the arrest to avoid an on-site confrontation at the Bridge Plaza. According to a Niagara-region source familiar with the arrest who spoke on background, the moment itself was quiet. There was no tactical entry. There was no shouting. There were 2 federal officers in plain dress, an unmarked vehicle, and the kind of brief, careful conversation that precedes a public officer being walked out of a private space in handcuffs. He was asked if he understood the charges as they were read to him. RCMP officer. Officer Notarianni, do you understand what's been read to you? Notarianni. I understand. RCMP officer. Anything you want to say at this time? Notarianni. I want to speak to my lawyer. RCMP officer. That's your right. He did not resist. He did not deny. He did not explain. He invoked, calmly and clearly, the only right that mattered at that moment, and the RCMP officers, professionally and without comment, allowed him to exercise it. His phone was seized. His CBSA-issued duty equipment, already turned in. His employment with the Canada Border Services Agency, suspended pending the outcome of the proceedings. By the end of that day, Daniel Notarianni was a former CBSA officer. The charges were announced publicly on March 18, 2026, at a media availability at RCMP O Division Headquarters in London, Ontario. Superintendent Dale Foote, the officer in charge of border integrity for Federal Policing Central Region, delivered the statement. Multiple counts under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act for the Opium dimension. Multiple counts under the Cannabis Act for the Cannabis dimension. Likely additional offenses under the Customs Act and the Excise Act for the tobacco smuggling dimension. And the count that carried the weight of the entire matter, breach of trust by a public officer, contrary to Section 122 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Section 122 is not a long provision. It is one sentence. Every official who, in connection with the duties of his office, commits fraud or a breach of trust, whether or not the fraud or breach of trust would be an offense if it were committed in relation to a private person, is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 5 years. 5 years is the statutory ceiling for the Section 122 count alone. The CDSA opium counts, however, carry substantially heavier exposure on conviction, particularly for a public officer convicted in the context of facilitating importation. Daniel Notarianni's first court appearance was scheduled for March 23, 2026, in Welland, Ontario. The matter is being handled by the Ontario provincial court system at the provincial level for now, with the Federal Crown Prosecutor's Office leading on the drug counts. Notarianni was released on conditions pending his next appearance. Surrendered passport, residence restriction, no contact with the co-accused, no contact with current or former CBSA personnel except as permitted by counsel. He has not entered a formal plea. He has not made any public statement. His counsel has confirmed that the defense intends to vigorously contest every element of the Crown's case. The file is now one of the most closely watched border corruption prosecutions in the Niagara-region since the 2017 Chad Gale matter at the Peace Bridge. The implications, regardless of outcome, extend past one officer and one truck. The CBSA's internal affairs detection capability is on trial alongside the accused. The architecture of primary inspection lane discretion is on trial. The institutional question of how Canada protects its busiest commercial truck crossings from the only kind of corruption that can move multi-category contraband through them in industrial quantities, that question is on trial too. Daniel Notarianni is presumed innocent. He will remain presumed innocent unless and until the Crown proves its case, beyond a reasonable doubt, in a Welland courtroom, or until Notarianni himself enters a plea. That process has just begun. That case was layered. But the case on the right-hand side, on a different border and with a very different ending, is the one I have not been able to stop thinking about. Click it.